Amma Asante has directed 2 episodes of XX's limited series Mrs. America, one examining the 1972 Democratic National Convention and the presidential campaign of Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, and another looking at Betty Friedan and her debate with Phyllis Schlafly about the Equal Rights Amendment. We're joined by Amma. I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby. And Amma, the first thing I want to ask is, with episode 3, Shirley, what were some of the challenges you faced in recreating that giant 72 convention?
Well, it was so important that we did it authentically, and the sheer size of the convention was incredible. I think if I'm getting this number right, there were about 15,000 people there in 72. And, shooting a scene where you're following the internal and external journeys of the characters and the relationships within that convention and the story as well, but within the context of a world of 15,000 people, that was pretty tough. But there was a thrill to it as well, and the challenge in making sure that we got it right. And
I'm curious, were there any visual effects that were used in that we may not have noticed in watching the episode, in terms of making the whole area look more like it was being populated by that amount of people?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we definitely had a lot of people that we were shooting with, but obviously nowhere close to 15,000. So there's a lot of the effects involved in the scene. And again, it was about making sure that, obviously we populated the areas with real people that we had our real characters in, but making it feel like, the ceilings were higher, and that we were, that we had as much depth and as much width as possible to the whole thing, and that we could populate it with that many people. That was a huge and incredible VFX job that we had to embark on, and took a lot of planning.
So I want to contrast that actually with the other episode you directed called Betty, with that debate that Phyllis Schlafly had with Betty Friedan. And I'm curious, and that was a bit more intimate, even though, you had a crowd there, but between these 2 people, I'm curious, how long did it take to shoot that debate, and what was it like shooting that? Because that just seems like it was really, really intense.
Yeah, I mean, that was such an intense day, and it was, I believe it was an 18-hour day. So a really long day. It was definitely obviously smaller than the 72 convention. We still had some VFX involved in the scene, but it was so important to kind of convey the dynamic between Betty and Phyllis, but also Betty, Phyllis, and the audience. That audience of students that were there at the time, and their reaction to each of the women, and really unfolding the debate, kind of like a tennis match. Darby and I talked, and this idea of it being like a tennis match, and who was going to win each round, and at what point the whole balance kind of changes. Things turn around, and the weight really kind of drains from Betty and goes across to Phyllis, was something really important that we had to work out. But of course, you're reading all of that through the audience's reactions. And so, getting into the edit with that and making sure that the audience's reactions were kind of giving us the right messaging as well, in terms of, their understanding of who has the power in what moment within the context of that scene. That was a long, very, very intense day. And an intense day because you're working with 2 incredible actresses, and playing to their strengths, of course, but also making sure that whilst you're playing to their strengths, you're also playing to the story that you're trying to get across at the same time, which is not only the wider politics, the politics with a capital P, if you like, that are going on in the scene, but the politics with a small p as well, the intimate and personal politics. And
I'm curious. So we were actually discussing, before this and directing some episodes of The Handmaid's Tale. You really had more experience directing feature films, and I'm curious, what were some of the differences or maybe even similarities you encountered in directing a limited series for television as opposed to directing a feature?
Well, I think that I've been really lucky in that I've been able to really choose pieces of television that kind of really suit me, I think, as a filmmaker, and they kind of really fit in with the kind of stories that I've been telling within the context of film as well. Mrs. America in particular deals with, real, characters that existed and important moments in our history. And that's really what drew me to the project in many ways. I think what's great about any kind of storytelling on screen is the kind of team effort, working with a crew and the collaborative nature of all of that. And when you get into TV, I think there's even more so of that feeling in so many ways. I did a couple of episodes, there were other directors that worked on the other directors in the series, the other episodes in the series. And I think making sure that there was a continuity of look and of the characterizations, and that, one episode very smoothly feels like it passes on to the next, is something obviously that you don't have to think about when you're perhaps making a film that you've written and directed or that is all your own. So there's a joy to that. There was a joy to sort of having the camaraderie of the directors that did the 2 episodes before, Ryan and Anna, and then also Law, whose episodes come right after mine, and exchanging stories and exchanging creativity and, looking at lighting and looking at characterizations and why we want to shoot things in particular ways. I had a very particular way in which I wanted to shoot Shirley Chisholm, and a very particular way in which I wanted to shoot Uzo Aduba playing her. And that's because whilst she was Shirley was a very conservative woman in one way, she was a church-going woman. She was also a woman who broke boundaries, and she was very progressive in another way. And I love those characters that are a combination of the two things. They're both, progressive and conservative, or, progressive and traditional at the same time. And so I kind of wanted to shoot her in a way that would allow us to do that, to show that, in many ways. And so discussing all of that, being able to discuss with the other directors, the treatment that I was planning for her and why I was planning that treatment and how that would sit in with the way that the other episodes were being shot, and the choices that the other directors were making was just a really interesting process for me, and one that felt very collaborative.
I'm actually curious about that specific aspect. Would you meet or communicate with the other directors before shooting to sort of communicate those ideas to each other about how, and to make sure, like you said, that there was that continuity between all the episodes and it had that flow to it?
Well, certainly. So the way that it works when you're doing your block, my block overlapped with the first 2 episodes and the 5th and 6th episode. So my block was in between the 1st and the 3rd block. So I saw those directors that were either side of my block. And yes, definitely having conversations with them, meeting at weekends over a coffee, sometimes having those discussions. And with Ryan and Anna, who were exec producers on the show as well, just really talking about that much more clearly. And in fact, when I first was sent the Mrs. America pilot and the 2nd episode, and I sort of made it clear that if I would be happy to join the show, but really wanted to do an episode that involved Shirley Chisholm, and luckily that's the way it worked out. That meant that when I was sort of first talking to them about joining the show, right back even at that point, I was very clear about how I saw Shirley being shot. And I think it's really important at that point to make sure that vision fits in with the rest of what the producers intend, and the showrunner, what Darby intends for the show, because it'd be nothing worse than kind of joining the show and having all the ideas about the way you might want to shoot something, and it just doesn't fit. It's just not in keeping with the way that the other storytellers want to communicate the show. So it was really important that I talked about that way early on, and then just continued talking all the way through shooting my episodes.
So I'm actually curious. Obviously, you're not from around these parts.
Guess not. You can tell.
I'm curious. Are you familiar with the American women's movement of the 60s and 70s and the figures that are portrayed in the series?
Yeah, and I, like many people, there were definitely some characters that I was introduced to, like Bella and Betty, but we definitely, Bella Abzug and Betty Friedan, but absolutely, there was a huge overlap between the British women's movement and the American women's movement of the period. And so certainly in learning what I did about the movement of that time, I knew about Gloria Steinem, and I knew about Shirley Chisholm, who is, just a massive inspiration to so many of us, obviously not just in America, but in the UK and the Caribbean as well, as a woman of color. So this show did for me what I love about all of the projects that I've worked on so far, which is that, I get to exercise muscles that I've been exercising all along, and that I'm really confident in exercising. And then I get to explore new avenues that are teaching me something and that I'm learning about. And I learned a lot about the women's movement, as well as being able to, establish on screen what I already knew as well. And that was a great thing.
And I'm curious, being British, you have an interesting perspective on how gender equality has come along, both in your country and in ours. And
yeah.
I mean, your country has not only had one, but has had two female heads of government.
Yes.
Because I know the Queen's the head of state, but they're heads of government.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, are there any areas where you think the U.S. has outpaced the U.K. in terms of women's equality?
That's a really good question. It's interesting because when we look at our figures, and the first thing that comes to mind is female directors, for instance. I mean, Mrs. America has, I think bar one, every single one of the directors for each of the episodes was a woman. And I think about, but then when I look at the figures, they're pretty, they're pretty parallel. They're pretty on track when you look at the UK and when you look at the US. I'm trying to think of other areas where you've probably beaten us. And look, we haven't had certainly not a Black woman stand for Prime Minister yet. And the fact that you had Shirley Chisholm all of those years back, all the way back in the 70s, I think is a massive, massive deal. And obviously paved the way, I think, to a certain extent, to you having your first, president of color in Barack Obama. And so, the way that you win in these situations is really quite interesting, because you look at Shirley's run for presidency, and on the face of it, it wasn't successful, but ultimately the success can be seen in the fact that it laid a pathway for Obama, for Hillary. And so I would love to see some of those obstacles sort of challenged in the UK also, in a way that you've seen them at least be challenged in the US.
Well, thank you so much, Amma, for joining us. We wish you all the best this Emmy season. And to our viewers, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to see all our latest content. And don't forget to go to goldderby.com and use the Gold Derby app to make your predictions and see if you can outsmart the top prognosticators in Hollywood. Thanks again, Amma.
So lovely to talk to you. Thank you.